Today I'm going to mess further with chronology. Before we dial backwards in our time machine and explore Giotto and the Proto-Renaissance, let's first race through early Renaissance architecture. The Khan Academy podcast describe our two required works very well, and I'm not going to repeat these points. Instead, I'm going to show you other works by the same architects and talk more generally about Italian Renaissance architecture. Here, with some additions of course, is the skyline of the early Italian Renaissance. On the right, circled in green, you see Florence Cathedral, an Italian Gothic structure with a campanile or bell tower designed by Giotto, circled in blue, and Brunelleschi's famous Roman Renaissance dome. I talked about these in my introductory lecture. Further to your left, and circled in red, is the tower of the Palazzo della Signoria, the House of the Lords, or the Town Hall. Although they are now in museums, Donatello's David, Michelangelo's David, and Donatello's Judith all at some point stood in the piazza or square in front of this, symbolizing Florence's fight against more powerful neighbors. Here's a closer look at the Palazzo Vecchio, which is how the Palazzo della Signoria is now known. It's basically a fortified building. That's for protection against Florence's own citizens. There was a workers' uprising in Florence in the 14th century and many internal struggles afterwards. At this point in our history, Florence is a republic run by merchant oligarchs and increasingly by the Medici family. You will recall, I hope, that Brunelleschi lost the famous competition to sculpt and cast the baptistry doors. That project would keep Ghiberti busy for 20 years, but Brunelleschi, after sulking for a while, went off to Rome to study Roman buildings. Upon his return, he began to design classically inspired buildings, such as our required work, the Pazzi Chapel on the bottom, and this hospital, really orphanage for abandoned children, pictured on top. That the city commissioned such a work and wanted it to be beautiful says something important about Florentine civic culture. The hospital isn't a required work, but it's similar enough to the Pazzi Chapel that you might well get hit by an attribution question. So what similarities do you see between these two buildings, both designed by Brunelleschi? Well, the design of both buildings is dominated by the Roman arch and based on two geometric figures, the cube and the hemisphere or half sphere. If you remember the terms simplicity, symmetry, and geometry, you can describe almost any Renaissance building. The building also employs terracotta roundels or tondos, both words are used, between the arches. These are actually terracotta sculptures produced by the famous Della Robbia family, which had discovered new glazing techniques and created a terracotta sculpture empire that continues to this day. This chapel, which is a required work, was donated by the wealthy Pazzi family to the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce in Florence. It originally served as the chapter house or meeting room for the Franciscan friars. Again, we see the geometrical elements, semicircles, cubes, and rectangles. And here is a closer view of the roundels or tondos. Note the four evangelists and the pendentives. By now you should recognize their symbols. And the apostles below the cornice. Who is he? Who is he? Did you catch the keys? That's surely St. Peter. Luca della Robbia sculpted the evangelists, but the apostles have been attributed to della Robbia, to Brunelleschi himself, and even to Donatello. The Pazzi Chapel was designed on the simple central plan that Brunelleschi so admired in the Pantheon. Here you see Brunelleschi's plan and the loggia that was added to his plan later, but is a typical feature of Renaissance architecture. Again, note how the design employs pietra serena stone, that's that gray stone, to set off the walls and to highlight the building's geometric regularity. We also see an oculus in the dome, another shout-out to Roman architecture and especially the Pantheon. By the way, art historians now think that Brunelleschi drew up the initial plan but died before the building's execution and detailing. He also did not design the second floor. We've already learned about Brunelleschi's dome, the most famous work of Renaissance architecture, but mysteriously absent from the list. Here is the interior of Santo Spirito, also designed by Brunelleschi. Note again the rhythmic simplicity, the use of arches and Corinthian columns, the contrast between plaster and pietra serena, and the use of roundels as a decorative element. And once again, Brunelleschi shows off his mathematical skills. The nave is exactly twice as high as it is wide. This extreme geometric regularity made his buildings both highly rhythmic and serene, and these are both trademarks of Renaissance architecture. Renaissance Florentine architects also specialized in residential architecture. No surprise when their patrons were mostly wealthy merchants. So what classical elements do you perceive in our required work on the left? The photo on the right should be a pretty broad hint. Alberti deliberately echoed the ascending orders of the Colosseum. Tuscan, a form of Doric with a base, followed by Ionic and then Corinthian. In the place of rounded columns, however, he used pilasters, or flat engaged columns. You may also have noted the arch-topped windows and the massive cornice. The effect is a screen-like grid, highly controlled, mathematical, proportional. Alberti not only designed buildings, he wrote books about painting, sculpture, and architecture. And in fact, he's one of our best guides to the art of the Renaissance and to the artists. But I should note that some historians challenge the attribution to Alberti. The College Board apparently does not. And here is still another famous Renaissance palace, although not a required work. Note the similarities to the Palazzo you just saw. Cosimo de' Medici wanted elegance without ostentation or obvious luxury. Note the rusticated, that is rough-edged brick, which was a common Roman feature. The internal courtyard looks a lot like Brunelleschi's interiors, simple, geometric, and organized around the arch. And now we're going to move back in time to the Proto-Renaissance, which in turn will introduce one of our two topics for tomorrow, Renaissance painting.